Hello, welcome to the World War Lab channel. Today we dive into one of the most shocking turning points of the Pacific War, a moment when confidence, tradition, and long-held assumptions collided with a brutal new reality in the jungles of Guadalcanal. August 19, 1942. In the dense jungle near Taivu Point on Guadalcanal, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Ayamai of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company recorded his observations in a diary. His words would later capture the disbelief and shock that many Japanese soldiers felt when they first encountered American forces. Beneath the heavy canopy of towering palm trees and choking vines, Ayamai and 916 other men from Colonel Kaineo Ichiki's detachment had just come ashore from destroyers. Their nighttime landing marked the completion of an insertion that Japanese command believed would be the opening move in retaking Henderson Field. They had been assured that the Americans numbered perhaps 2,000 men, poorly trained, easily frightened, and softened by comfortable lives of luxury. Colonel Ichiki himself had dismissed all warnings about waiting for reinforcements. "These are Americans," he told his officers. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." What none of these battle-hardened veterans, who had fought in China and Southeast Asia, could have imagined was that they were about to face something entirely new in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was not simply defeat, which in itself was unthinkable for soldiers who had known nothing but victory since 1937. It was a destruction of every tactical assumption, every strategic concept, and every ideological certainty that defined the Japanese way of war. The jungle itself will become an American weapon. The darkness, long believed to belong to Japanese forces, will betray them, and the overwhelming superiority in equipment, coordination, and sheer destructive power would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat. That transformation had begun 2 weeks earlier on August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. Under the command of General Alexander Van de Grift, the Leathernecks were carrying out Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. On paper, their mission appeared simple: seize a nearly completed Japanese airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold a position until relieved. In reality, they were about to fight the longest and most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history up to that point, in an environment that would push human endurance to its absolute limits. The island itself was a vision of tropical hell. Guadalcanal stretched roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, with an interior dominated by mountains rising to 8,000 feet into clouds that never seemed to clear. The coastal plain where Henderson Field was located was a tangled mixture of Kenai grass, swamp, and jungle so thick that visibility was often reduced to just a few feet. The heat was suffocating, and the humidity rarely dropped below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in such dense clouds that men inhaled them as they breathed. Rivers and streams that appeared clear and inviting in reconnaissance photographs were infested with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would eventually incapacitate more men than enemy action. Yet on that first morning, the Marines discovered the airfield almost undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops stationed there had fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and most importantly, the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already at work completing the runway. They would name a Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft would land, and the island would become the base of what history would remember as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese response was swift, and for American naval forces, it was catastrophic. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa led a force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the darkness in a brilliantly executed surprise attack. The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. 4 heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra, were sent to the bottom in less than an hour. More than 1,000 sailors perished in the burning, oil-covered waters. The surviving Allied naval forces withdrew, taking with them most of the supplies that had not yet been unloaded. The Marines on Guadalcanal were left stranded, isolated, facing a reinforced enemy with barely half the equipment and food they needed. What the Japanese high command failed to understand in those early days of August was that Henderson Field had become the key to everything. Control of the airfield meant control of the surrounding seas during daylight hours. Aircraft operating from Henderson could strike any Japanese ship within a 200-mile radius. This single reality would shape the entire campaign. The Japanese could dominate the night, sending troops and supplies aboard fast destroyers and missions that became known as the Tokyo Express. But once dawn arrived, American aircraft ruled the skies. The strategic situation demanded that Japan retake Henderson Field immediately before the Americans could strengthen and fortify their position. Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task to Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakate's 17th Army, based at Rabaul. Hayakate, however, had only limited forces at his disposal. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kyote Kawaguchi was still at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The closest available unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam and was originally intended for the Midway operation that had been canceled after the naval disaster in June. Colonel Kaineo Ichiki was an infantry school instructor with a reputation as a first-rate tactician. He was also known for his impulsive nature and his absolute confidence in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over American material strength. Before departing truck for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received clear orders to wait for the rest of his regiment before attempting any assault on the airfield, but he held little respect for American soldiers. He had studied reports from China, from the Philippines, and from every place where Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. In his mind, they lacked discipline, broke under pressure, and were incapable of matching Japanese warriors in close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first attachment to Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing was carried out smoothly and went completely undetected by American forces. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols to evaluate enemy strength and defensive positions. To him, it was a routine beginning to what he believed would be a swift and decisive victory. It was a tactical decision that would prove fatal. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, commanded by Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal track toward Coley Point when they suddenly encountered Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief but savage firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese troops and captured several important documents that revealed the presence of a significant enemy force operating in the area. Even more alarming, those captured papers showed that the Japanese had dramatically underestimated the strength and preparedness of the American defenders. Captain Brush rushed back to the perimeter with his intelligence haul. General Alexander Vandegrift immediately grasped the implications. A Japanese attack was coming soon, and it would likely strike from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce the defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of the river the Marines called the Tenaru. In reality, it was the Ilu River, but the mistaken name would remain fixed in history and appear in nearly every account of the battle that followed. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the riverbank, positioning machine guns to create overlapping, interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the sandbar. What followed would become one of the most lopsided engagements in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, instead of waiting for reports from his missing patrols or for reinforcements to arrive, chose to attack immediately on the night of August 20th. Pushing into the early hours of August 21st, he ordered a frontal assault straight across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized the power of spirit and the effectiveness of aggressive night attacks to overcome superior enemy firepower. Ichiki believed his battle-hardened veterans could smash through American defenses through sheer audacity and brutal close-quarters combat, where Japanese soldiers were trained to excel with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, A Solomon Island scout named Jacob Vuza, who had escaped after hours of torture at the hands of the Japanese, staggered into the Marine lines with a desperate warning. The Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the assault began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, shouting battle cries, firing their rifles and throwing grenades as they ran. They advanced directly into a killing zone the Marines had prepared with cold, methodical precision. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons, perfected during World War I, became the unsung backbone of Marine firepower. Each gun was capable of sustaining around 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, as long as the water jacket surrounding the barrel remained filled. The Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting locations, ensuring that no section of the sandbar was left uncovered. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through bodies, ripping flesh and shattering bone. Those who somehow managed to cross the sandbar faced an even more terrifying obstacle: 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially massive shotgun shells that blasted out clouds of steel and turned human beings into mangled wreckage. The attack went on for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese troops hurled themselves into the wall of fire. Some reached the Marine lines and fought hand to hand. Marines defended their positions with rifles, knives, fists, and whatever else they could grab, but the defenses held. The overlapping fields of fire made any breakthrough impossible. As dawn drew near, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely collapsed. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water along the river's edge. Daybreak brought no salvation for the surviving Japanese. General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack using elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart Light tanks rolled across the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken shelter in the nearby coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregiscus, observing from a Marine position, described the scene with chilling clarity. He wrote that it was fascinating to watch the tanks bustling among the trees, pivoting, turning, and spitting sheets of yellow flame. The Marines had not realized how many Japanese were hiding in the grove. Group after group was flushed out and cut down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, roughly 800 were dead. About 128 survivors, mostly men from support units that had remained near the landing site, disappeared into the jungle. They later managed to send a radio message to 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, although accounts of his final moments differ. The official Japanese version claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Other witnesses insisted he died while leading one last desperate charge. Marine casualties, by contrast, were remarkably light, about 40 men killed or wounded. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese forces was devastating. Captured documents and post-war testimonies revealed the shock of discovering that an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans had not fought in the way Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic during a night assault. They did not break when charged by screaming soldiers. Instead, they waited in prepared positions, allowed the attackers to enter carefully planned killing zones, and then destroyed them with concentrated, disciplined firepower. The most disturbing realization came from examining captured equipment and surveying the battlefield. The Americans possessed a level of material abundance that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to imagine. The Browning machine guns did not jam, did not overheat beyond their design limits, and did not fail because of poor maintenance or lack of spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support available to Marines surpassed anything the Japanese could deploy, and the coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered before. Within days of catastrophe on the Tenaru, additional Japanese forces, were already being rushed toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a major naval operation to support the next attempt to recapture Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships departed Truk on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment, plus 500 naval infantrymen. After the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one of the transports, Japanese command made a crucial decision. Slow transport ships would no longer be used. Instead, they would rely entirely on destroyers in what soon became known as the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered nearly 5,000 troops of Major General Kotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express proved highly effective for moving men. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, greatly reducing their exposure to American air attacks. But this method carried a fatal weakness. Heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and most critically, sufficient food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical limitation would eventually doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived carrying only what they could transport on their backs. They depended on foraging in the jungle and on whatever small amount of supplies could be slipped through American lines. As the campaign dragged on, Japanese troops would find themselves fighting not only against American firepower, but against starvation itself. General Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for a 3-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coastal corridor. A second force would attack from the south, pushing through dense jungle to hit what Japanese intelligence believed to be the weakest point in the American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, advancing along an inland ridge that overlooked Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi did not realize was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely avenue of approach. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, carried out a raid on the village of Tasimboko on September 8th. There, his men discovered massive Japanese supply dumps, clear evidence that a large enemy force was concentrating in the area. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They intended to advance from the south, using the ridge as their route of attack. He requested permission to establish a defensive line directly on the ridge itself. General Vandegrift approved the request. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same careful precision that had characterized the preparations at the Tenaru. Machine guns were in place to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortar crews registered their weapons on likely approach routes. Artillery units of the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions. Every possible advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and prepared in advance. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine about 1,000 meters long, made up of 3 distinct hills covered with kanai grass and scattered trees. On both sides were deep ravines, heavily forested, and in some places nearly impassable. It was perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry, and if properly defended, it was also a perfect killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's reckless frontal charge at the Tenaru, this attack was more sophisticated. Japanese infantry infiltrated to the ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to surround and envelop the Marine positions. Small units probed for weaknesses. When they found them, larger groups concentrated their efforts in attempts to break through. The fighting was savage and chaotic. In the darkness, Marines often found themselves engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had slipped to within grenade range. Yet the defensive preparations held. Whenever Japanese forces massed for a breakthrough attempt, Marine mortars and artillery smashed into them. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high-explosive shells so close to friendly positions that fragments wounded American troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red in the darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, and anything else they could use as a weapon. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the attack at the Teneru, moved through the Marine lines, encouraging the men and pointing out Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became one of the critical points of the defense. When members of his gun crew were killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks. He would later be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor during the fighting on the ridge, and 19 more would receive the Navy Cross. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to achieve a breakthrough, but Kawaguchi still had troops in reserve and prepared to renew the assault the following night. Edson pulled his lines back toward the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces. General Van de Griff sent reinforcements, increasing the defending force to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but now the Marines were ready with stronger positions and even more concentrated firepower. The second night of fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi committed his remaining forces in desperate attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position completely unassailable. Japanese soldiers charged again and again, dying by the hundreds under machine gun fire. Some attacks pushed within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. At one point, the situation became so desperate that Edson himself seized a rifle and joined the firing line. But once again, American firepower and careful defensive preparation prevailed. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties were enormous. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers had been killed on and around Edson's Ridge. Marine losses totaled about 104 killed and more than 200 wounded among the Raider and Parachute battalions. The Ridge, which will forever be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, had become a powerful symbol of the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, the battle represented a profound shock to their entire understanding of warfare. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies repeated the same realization again and again. Japanese soldiers had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where their training, aggression, and spiritual resolve would give them the advantage. Instead, they were confronted by artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all employed with a level of concentration and coordination they could not match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones. They waited until the enemy entered them. Then they destroyed them with carefully synchronized fire support. The battles at the Teneru and at Bloody Ridge established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would attack based on courage, night tactics, and mastery of close combat. American forces would answer with overwhelming firepower, combined arms coordination, and defensive positions prepared with ruthless efficiency. The outcome was almost always the same. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. American casualties were serious, but sustainable. Yet numbers alone cannot convey the true horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon, killing without favor or mercy. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division reported more than 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled nearly 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was almost universal. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate into their skin. Jungle rot produced open sores that never healed in the endless humidity. Dental problems went untreated, turning simple cavities into abscesses and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even more terribly. Their supply situation was disastrous from the beginning. Soldiers were supposed to receive proper field rations, but the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver enough food. Men survived on whatever they could forage in the jungle, supplemented by small rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin. Starvation became a constant companion. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention quickly ran out and was never adequately replaced. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treated with proper medicine. Captured Japanese documents later revealed the horrifying scale of the crisis. A medical officer's report from late October stated that more than 60% of the 17th Army's troops on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of roughly 50 per day, most from starvation and illness rather than from battle wounds. American conditions, though harsh, were fundamentally different. Supply ships protected by aircraft from Henderson Field during daylight hours regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. There were shortages, especially in August and early September, when naval defeats temporarily cut the Marines off. But these were never permanent. By October, the supply flow had become reliable. Marines ate canned rations that were bland and unpopular, but provided sufficient calories and nutrition. Ammunition was abundant enough that machine gunners could fire until their barrels were worn out and then request replacements. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capability, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfa drugs to fight infection, and evacuation of serious cases to rear-area hospitals. Japanese logistics, by contrast, consisted of whatever could be carried on destroyer decks or smuggled through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was conserved so strictly that orders often limited firing to moments of absolute necessity. Medical treatment meant a bandage if one was available, amputation without anesthesia if one was not, or death if infection set in. Severely wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind, expected to commit suicide rather than burden their units or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese launched the largest offensive of the entire campaign. General Harakichi Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command the operation. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including veteran troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort again coming from the south through dense jungle, much like the approach used at Bloody Ridge. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination, and artillery support that had finally been delivered by destroyers. The offensive opened on October 23rd with preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, a rarity on Guadalcanal because of the immense difficulty of transporting them, led an assault across the Matanacar River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Americal Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart light tank destroyed all 9 Japanese tanks in rapid succession. The attack collapsed almost immediately, leaving heavy casualties behind. The main assault began on the night of October 24th into the early hours of October 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu advanced from the south, attempting to break through the American lines guarding Henderson Field. They were met by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that followed became legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in wave after wave throughout the night. Small breakthroughs were sealed off by immediate counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then picked up rifles and kept fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that landed only yards from Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood ready to provide naval gunfire support if it was needed. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces in Henderson Field, but it did not break. Sergeant John Basilone, who had already distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, once again became a decisive figure in the defense. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, Basilone personally carried boxes of cartridges through enemy fire to keep the guns operating. He repaired damaged weapons while under fire, refusing to leave his position. When one gun emplacement was overrun, he drew his .45 pistol and led a counterattack that drove the Japanese back and restored the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night assaults. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers had died in their attempt to break through the American defenses. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded, severe by any standard, but still within limits that could be sustained. October 1942 also marked the beginning of major naval engagements that would decisively shift the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th to November 15th, became one of the most intense and chaotic series of surface battles in naval history. In a confused nighttime clash on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers intercepted a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hai and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only two American flag officers killed in surface engagements during the entire war, were both killed in the fighting. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, and 3 more destroyers were heavily damaged. The Japanese lost the battleship Hai, which was crippled in the night action and sunk by American aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th into November 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment. This time, she was intercepted by the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a stunning demonstration of American radar-directed gunnery, Washington fired 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely even see their target. Kirishima was fatally damaged and sank with heavy loss of life. Perhaps most decisively, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy that was attempting to land the 38th Division along with heavy equipment. Of the 11 transport ships involved, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and all of them were destroyed by air attack and artillery before they could unload their cargo. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. This marked the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a properly equipped and organized ground force. For the Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcements and resupply. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys had been destroyed, and that no more help was coming. Rations were cut again. Men who were already starving were ordered to survive on even less. Medical supplies, which had been critically scarce, now disappeared entirely. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals, where doctors could do nothing except watch them die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a picture of slow collapse. Entries spoke of rice rations reduced to a single ball per day, disease spreading unchecked. Bodies burned when soldiers still had the strength to do so. The terrifying realization that no more supplies would arrive meant eating grass, tree bark, and roots. Deaths caused by poisonous plants. The steady transformation of organized soldiers into desperate, starving shadows. December brought the final reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They could not admit defeat publicly, but privately they recognized that continuing the operation would mean the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, down from a peak strength of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps only 7,000 were physically capable of walking. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation that they could barely crawl. The evacuation, designated Operation Coup, will become one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Using destroyer runs similar to Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces evacuated 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable achievement under extreme circumstances, but could not hide the scale of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had reached a peak strength of roughly 36,000 men. Of these, Approximately 25 to 30,000 died. Around 14,800 were killed in combat, and another 10 to 15,000 perished from disease and starvation. American casualties were also heavy, but they were sustainable. The Marine and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal suffered about 1,600 killed in action, around 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. Unlike Japan, the United States could replace these losses. New divisions were already training. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be destroyed. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thinking cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every major offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic losses. The realization that American forces were not only materially superior, but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring extreme hardship shattered pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or gave post-war interviews consistently emphasized the same themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting qualities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence reports had suggested. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for prolonged operations against an enemy that controlled the sea and the air. Fourth, spiritual strength and tactical skill alone were powerless against systematic disadvantages in firepower and industrial capacity. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed a strikingly consistent conclusion. They had believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that war is decided by systems. The Americans had systems for everything. Systems for supply, for medical care, for artillery support, for air coordination. Every one of those systems functioned. Japanese systems failed because they had never been properly built in the first place. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed gave detailed accounts that contradicted the official explanations for defeat. They admitted that American forces fought extremely well at night when defending prepared positions. They acknowledged that Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible environmental conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness because their logistics supported them. They recognized that American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and delivered with a level of precision they could not match. They observed that a single American battalion possessed more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical differences behind this superiority were significant. Japanese infantry on Guadalcanal fought primarily with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons that required manual cycling between each shot. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, which were also bolt-action, but these were increasingly supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as it became available. The Garand, with its 8-round clip and semi-automatic operation, provided a decisive advantage in firefights, allowing American soldiers to deliver a much higher volume of accurate fire. Machine guns revealed an even greater imbalance. The American M1917A1 Browning was water-cooled and capable of sustained fire for extended periods as long as water and ammunition were available. Japanese machine guns, mainly the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and easier to carry, but they lacked the ability to maintain prolonged fire. In defensive positions, where continuous suppressive fire was critical, this difference was decisive. Artillery superiority was perhaps the most important factor of all. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be broken down and transported through jungle terrain. These 75mm guns provided fast, accurate, and responsive fire support. Forward observers embedded with infantry units could request artillery missions and receive fire within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited in number, extremely difficult to move through jungle terrain, and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added another dimension that Japanese forces could not replicate. American destroyers and cruisers offshore could bombard Japanese positions or deliver rapid-fire support to Marine ground units. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval vessels allowed precise targeting, creating a seamless connection between land and sea firepower. Air power grew increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under miserable conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Forces pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber formations. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese troop concentrations, supply dumps, and transport ships. Japanese aircraft flying from a bow were forced to operate at the extreme limits of their range, leaving them little time over their targets and making sustained operations difficult. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14 Corps, now composed of both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks that steadily crushed the remaining Japanese positions. The offensive was supported by massive artillery barges, constant airstrikes, and naval gunfire from ships offshore. Japanese resistance remained determined, but was crippled by starvation, disease, and chronic shortages of ammunition. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated the island. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey: Tokyo Express no longer as terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. 6 months of brutal fighting had produced the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, Guadalcanal established patterns and revealed truths that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. For Japanese survivors, the lessons were devastating to pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been destroyed. Individual courage and tactical skill were not enough against systematic disadvantages in resources, logistics, and firepower. Night attacks and close-quarters combat, which had brought success in China, failed completely against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns. They were the foundation of sustained combat power. Control of the air and sea determined the outcome of battles on land. Some Japanese officers recognized the implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, later wrote that Japan needed a complete reassessment of its strategy. The Americans, he observed, were fighting an industrial war where material production and logistics determined victory. Japan, with its limited industrial capacity, could not hope to win such a conflict. But Japanese military culture, shaped by generations of tradition and reinforced by recent victories, could not easily accept such a fundamental revision. The official explanation for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and the unexpected strength of American defenses. It did not acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare that had worked against China was obsolete when facing a modern industrial power. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal, whether later captured or alive at the end of the war, became witnesses to a transformation they had never anticipated. They entered the campaign as confident warriors of what they believed was an invincible empire. They left it as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood that Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this psychological shift with painful clarity. They admitted that they had learned truths their leaders had concealed. The Americans were not weak. They were overwhelmingly strong, not only in weapons, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the ability to sustain long, grinding combat operations. Japanese soldiers fought with courage and skill. It did not matter. American forces fought with systems and resources that Japan simply could not match. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different lessons. For Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved that American forces could match Japanese troops in the sheer brutality of jungle combat. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. American defensive doctrine proved effective. Combined arms coordination worked exactly as intended. Individual American soldiers, when properly trained, led, and equipped, were fully capable of defeating Japanese forces in even the harshest conditions. At the same time, Americans developed a deep respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, and highly skilled adversaries who were willing to fight to the death rather than surrender. Their readiness to continue attacking despite hopeless odds, to endure starvation instead of giving up, and to die rather than retreat left a powerful impression on everyone who faced them. The contrast between the two sides' approaches to surrender and prisoner treatment highlighted fundamental cultural differences. American forces made repeated efforts to encourage Japanese surrender. They dropped leaflets, broadcast radio messages, and promised food and medical care to prisoners. These efforts achieved very little. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese soldiers who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were already too sick or wounded to resist. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation demonstrated that the Japanese defensive perimeter was not invulnerable. Allied strategies shifted from primarily defensive operations to sustained offensive campaigns. America's industrial and material advantages could be converted into battlefield success when applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. The loss of experienced troops, trained pilots, and precious warships could not be replaced at anything close to the rate at which the United States was producing new forces. The quiet decision to evacuate admitted, even if indirectly, that Japan could not sustain an attritional war against American industrial power. Veterans of Guadalcanal, on both sides, carried its impact for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived became the backbone of new units, passing on hard-earned lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division, withdrawn from Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before it was fit to return to combat. Japanese survivors faced an even darker future. Those evacuated during Operation Coup were scattered among other units across the Pacific, carrying with them the psychological burden of defeat and the knowledge that American forces were far stronger than pre-war propaganda had ever admitted. Many would later die in subsequent battles, as Japan's strategic position steadily worsened. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months of relentless fighting for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastlines. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during and after the campaign, became a major Allied base for further operations throughout the Solomon Islands. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal became a case study in amphibious warfare, jungle combat logistics, air-ground coordination, and the integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare required more than bravery and tactical skill. It demanded industrial capacity, reliable logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over long periods. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses surpassed 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and conditions that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. In strictly military terms, the strategic importance of Guadalcanal was judged to have justified this terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It proved that Japan could be defeated in sustained ground combat. It established the patterns of air and naval superiority that would dominate the remainder of the war. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately the story of a collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern war. One side believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, that courage could overcome material disadvantage, and that tactical skill alone could secure victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in the systematic application of industrial power, logistics, and firepower, multiplied through combined arms coordination. The jungles of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these philosophies met. The outcome, though it took 6 months of brutal combat to reach, showed that concentrated fire support and logistics, combined with competent leadership and determined soldiers, create a form of military power that Japanese forces simply could not match. For Japanese soldiers who survived and later told their stories, Guadalcanal was the moment when reality destroyed illusion. They realized their training had been built on false assumptions. Their tactics were designed for a different kind of war. Their logistics had been inadequate from the beginning, and their nation was fighting a conflict it could not win through courage and sacrifice alone. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally powerful lessons. They discovered they could match Japanese soldiers in the brutality of close combat. They proved that American industrial power could be transformed into battlefield dominance. They developed jungle warfare tactics and doctrines that would guide future campaigns. And they destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with realistic understanding of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was the place where Japanese soldiers came to fear not American fighters as individuals, formidable though they were, but the relentless, systematic, and overwhelming application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every battle. It was not fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept, but fear of futility. The realization that courage and sacrifice meant little against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded were treated, whose artillery never stopped, whose aircraft ruled the skies, and whose industry replaced losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first confronted American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a permanent shift in the Pacific War. From that moment forward, Japan would fight defensively, struggling against an enemy whose material advantage grew with each passing month. The jungle battles of Guadalcanal became the model for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the most hostile terrain against a determined enemy, provided they possessed strong logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.